Hello, everyone. This week we are looking at Exodus 7 through 13, and we're going to do something a little bit different. So, if for those that are listening, please feel free to mention in the comments the type of format that you prefer. I've done this in the past as we went through Doctrine and Covenants. My go to is to do more of a deep dive into a particular doctrine or principle. I try to emphasize that because I feel like that's one of the missing things in the culture is that we don't do a deep dive into the principles. People will deep dive into history, they may deep dive into linguistics, they may deep dive into anything other than the core spiritual ramifications of things. And then as you know, as I iterate over and over and over and over again, that I want things to be relevant. And the axis point of the relevance for me a lot of times hinges on the doctrines and how they impact us in our perspective, psychologically speaking, and the undergrounding philosophical issues that apply to all of us at an existential perspective. That tends to be, and if you go through the previous videos, you'll see that that's how we've gone through that. Today, as I've done in the past, I might go a little bit more through the verses and chapters one by one and kind of pick out some of the key principles for you, giving you more of an overview. And we are going to start to transition to some different segments until we get to the segment of the prophets. Um, Deuteronomy will probably have a lot more preachings, and Deuteronomy is one of the most underrated and underestimated books of all scripture. It's very, very powerful. It's got some great, great doctrinal pieces in there that are just core and amazing. This is what Moses taught. This is his, like, think of it like the gospel of Moses, if you're to frame it that way. Very, very awesome. But when we get to Kings, Chronicles, Samuel, Job, you're gonna see that there's a lot of text and sometimes just very small amounts of principles there. It won't be till we get to the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that you're just gonna see a dramatic change in how these are represented, like the doctrines and principles that are touched on. It's just so very, very rich. The problem you run into there is it's so rich that you're like, which of these incredible principles and doctrines am I supposed to focus on in my lesson? Do I just do a cursory touch on all of them, or do I deep dive? The same dilemma we're discussing today. Um, so depending on the segments, as things are going to thin out a little bit, and I don't want this to be overly emphasizing the history. I will let other people do that. I don't overemphasize the linguistics. I try to focus more on the relevance. And I know because we did a deep dive last time, I just wanted to point out things that you maybe you've been familiar if you listen to other podcasts in Exodus 1, the midwives. And these midwives, there is some scholars that may say, are these Egyptian midwives? Are the Hebrew midwives? The consensus usually leans more towards Hebrew. And one of I'd say the convincing evidences of that is the names of them are not the Shipra and Puah are more Hebrew names. So the ones that are mentioned by name there's more evidence that they're Hebrew, but it's kind of an interesting idea to think about, like, who were the midwives that were there protecting the children from Pharaoh's attempt to rid the Hebrews and control their population by getting rid of children. So the this is incredible to see how many women up to this point have been mentioned and play a significant role. So we have the Hebrew midwives here and the ones that are named specifically that do a tremendous job of protecting Israel from the from the Pharaoh who's trying to, it's like, control the population and basically create a command to where they're going to kill them. And eventually, I would say that this is also relevant because it leads to the birth of Moses, right? If it weren't for these people investing in that, and it's very likely that Moses's mom may have also been one of the people involved because she gets hired by the daughter of the Pharaoh to take over. So she was involved somewhat in childcare and somewhat of her, you could say, profession. In Exodus 2, verse 1, in one of the commentaries that I read, it was just this one of those, and he dwelt in a tent moments. So Exodus 2 2. And there went a man out of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and bare a son. And the reason why that's emphasized is there's nothing special about that. There's nothing special about the origin of the person who became a Messiah figure for the Jews, who we would look at through our Christian perspective as a type and a shadow for the Messiah to come, who is Jesus Christ. That Moses, on how high of a standing he is and where he came from, is from, it's that lowly birth, and it's a motif that shows up. Now, Christ comes from a lowly birth, but when you look at his genealogy, it's just like full of all sorts of problematic relationships. And it's definitely, when you look at this lineage, him being the King of Kings, though he has a regal claim to the throne via his relation to David. The other aspect of that is when you just look at, all these very taboo situations, sometimes even murder, right? When we look at the house of Judah, what Judah was involved in, these are not very glamorous or righteous things. And many will like to point that out for the sake of saying that the Messiah can even come through a lineage. It's supposed to represent that the Messiah is available and can manifest in any situation to all sinners, to all those who are outcasts. And you could also utilize and sneak in this Exodus as well, that even the lowly common man can manifest and bring forth, has access to the Messiah. So I mean that might, you could look at that and be like, that's a bit of an overreach in this. And I hope that's not the case, that it's an overreach. I do think that there is something genuinely valuable in looking at that, because it's going to apply to us as people. And it's, do you ever feel like, why would God reach out to me? Like, who am I? In fact, as we get to Moses and his call, right, that tends to be the consensus for a lot of people called to prophets. Like, wait, why are you choosing me, when he brings up the I am slow of speech? So last week we went on a deep dive looking into the potential meanings for the I am that I am. So take a listen to that, as well as looking also more specifically into the meaning of the name the Lord, uh, Yeshua or Jehovah, and the different main beliefs on what that could mean, and also just like the relevance of that for us in our day-to-day lives. So take a listen to that. So Moses gets his call, and one of the main questions to look at is, if you were teaching, would be, who does God call to be his representatives? Who does God call to be his prophets, to bear his name, to bear his authority? And up to this point, we can look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We can now look at Moses, and each and every one of these individuals has their flaws. And Moses, he points out that I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said unto him, who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or the deaf? Or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, I will be with thy mouth. I will teach thee what thou shalt say. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know not, I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he shall see thee, he will be glad at heart. And thou shalt speak unto him and put words in his mouth. And I will be with thy mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. And he will be thy spokesman unto the people. And he shall be even as he, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. it mentions later in the scriptures that Moses was the most meek of all men on the earth. And I can't help but go back in time to this episode that we have in Exodus where Moses, and we don't know all, I mean, there's so much you could build around the story, but Moses was grown that he went out unto his brethren. He looked on their burdens and he spied on an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And this, this is this is where it's theoretical. But I'm like, I can't help but wonder if that influences some of this, right? He's timid to go before the Israelites. He's concerned that they're going to reject him. That Moses said, "But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee." Right? He's an outsider, raised in Egypt. He's someone who has killed another man. I said, I can't help but wonder how much that may have influenced some of these interactions. I don't know we don't know the full moral character of him, but we do know that in the encounter with the burning bush, if you were to go look at some of these subtle details, there's a lot that you can pick up here, right? Now, the mountain of God, even Horeb, where there is this burning bush, the mountain being a high place, it we all know that it's the high place in the mountains is associated with the temple of God, but another way of looking at the temple and the high place is if you were to look at it from a psychological perspective, you can think of it in terms of your aims. The highest place is representative of the highest aim, the highest good. And that's where God dwells. He dwells at the highest place. And so you can try to apply that to your own principles and prayers when you're saying, what is the highest way of looking at it? What is the best way? What is the most good way to look at that? The imagery of the burning bush, and again, I can't give you some divine translation and interpretation of this. I can look more archetypal, and trees can represent a lot of different things. In this sense, the idea of a bush, this, it's an aspect of nature, and nature is something that passes away. It comes and it goes. It's temporal. And fire is something that would destroy a bush. And the fact that the bush burned with fire and was not consumed is a representation of something that is eternal. That when God combines himself with something or his spirit is upon something, he can take that which is natural and make it eternal. So there's some really cool imagery that's found just even within the midst of the language here. And there's a lot here about, and Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Right? Moses was observant, he was keen, he paid attention. And this makes us wonder. So if you're applying this to yourself, it's like, what are the things that we are not looking at? Right? What are the things like, are we paying attention? And what are we paying attention to? Are we paying attention to trees, things that are of the earth, natural things? Are we paying attention to eternal things, things that are high, things that are elevated, a mountain? Are we able to identify the Spirit of God putting its eternal spirit on things that are natural? And I like that. So if that's a question, like if you're teaching, that would be, can anyone give me an example of how they've seen a burning bush type motif in their life where God is putting eternity, the eternal aspect into the temporal, into the natural? Because what is temporal and natural? That's us. We are temporal and natural, and God, when his spirit is in there, it burns. It creates this eternal aspect, which blends in well, again, when we look at the name of the Lord, the I am that I am, one of the most consensus is a reference to the eternal aspect. So I like that. But what can you identify? This is more the introspective question would be, what can you identify in your life that is akin to a burning bush? Something that has the eternal spirit around it, something that should have been consumed but isn't. Now, because I am in the psychological field, it would be like I have people who struggle with suicidal ideations, who struggle with depression, and the fact that they have not been consumed by nature, have not been consumed by just the natural deterministic forces of the hopelessness. I see that there's something of eternity in there. And if you pay attention and you turn aside, it's when you start to pay attention, you see the kind of the ask and ye shall receive, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you principle here, that he's seeking. That turning aside is that representation of Moses seeking, and God acknowledges that. And then we see an increase of blessing and interaction as a result of him seeking. And that's where everything begins to evolve from there. And even other subtleties here, right? Draw not high hither, or draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Shoes elevate us. I mean, not that much, but what shoes do symbolically is they do elevate you literally. That's not usually their main intention, but it's this idea of your own dominance. We wear shoes because mankind has dominated nature. We're kings, we're strong. And so the idea is you're taking that off. It's emblematic of going back into the pre-Eden state, right? Where they didn't have clothes, they were naked, they were innocent. And so it you can again, hopefully not an overread, but there is this removal, stripping away your pride, stripping away your accomplishments when you approach God. Because if you confront God with your own accomplishments and your own pride, you're not going to get the revelation. In fact, you see this contrast there as you start to look at Pharaoh. Now, whether that's intended in the message, the only reason I dwell on that is because these are true principles. I I believe that these texts may indicate that, and ultimately my goal is to look at the text through a way that can be uplifting and nourishing, and hopefully not betray the words of the text. And so, it mentions that the ground from which you are standing is holy ground. So when you encounter that which is divine, when you encounter that which is holy, it is your goal should be to strip yourselves of your pride. Your accomplishments, your domination, the things that you've done do not matter in the presence of God. If they do, they're going to create this barrier and rift and pride that we'll take more account of as we study Pharaoh. So I didn't emphasize as much that this is a remembrance of the covenant and a manifestation that God does remember. And the one of the main discussions you would encounter philosophically and theologically is, why did God allow it to get this bad before he sent Moses? Uh, I listened to one perspective that was describing this almost as a literary aspect. Is uh, he went really deep into the Jungian psychology, where the farther you go out of balance in one way, the more the subconscious is crying for that. So the more that you go into chaos, the more that there's a cry for order, and the more that the deeper you go into chaos or to order, the more that there's a cry for chaos in your life, and that within the opposition in all things, that there is something that's a kind of a self-correcting balance. And so um, in many ways, you can look at the horrors that people have gone through as well. I mean, this is a horrible story with the enslavement of the Jews, but we can say in more modern times we have things like the Holocaust and World War II, and all of these terrible things that have happened. It's like, why does the terrible thing have to happen first? And why could we skip the terrible thing and go straight to the redemption? And I think from our LDS perspective, with the idea of respecting agency, it is that God will allow the agency of man to play out to a particular point, to where the judgment of God can be can be secure. And I think even one of the phrases it uses here in Exodus is specifically that the blood, like the blood is crying out from the earth. And so again, when you read that from a perspective that we get from the Book of Mormon with Alma, where Alma has to watch the people who are burned in the fires, you could see the imagery of things crying out, right? The people are crying out. And it's not until the horrible thing happens that God can righteously go in and judge the individuals. It's not a Minority Report. If you've seen that movie with Tom Cruise situation where he goes through and prevents the bad from happening, he lets, in this case, Egypt have its agency, play things out. And even though the judgments that fall upon Pharaoh seem extremely harsh, when we think about all of the messaging that has been given beforehand, the opportunities to let people go, the opportunities to repent and come back and receive the grace of God, you can contrast this to the Pharaoh that was there in the days of Joseph, because he hearkened unto Joseph. He was humble enough to listen and read the signs and follow that so that they received the blessings. And this goes back as well when you look at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. There's some interactions with Abimelech and these Gentile nations where God sends them there, and there's this little test that seems to play out. And because they pass the test, God ends up blessing them instead of destroying them. Just like with Sodom and Gomorrah, the righteous individuals are go there and perform the test. And I guess this is what happens when individuals double down or triple down and don't pass the test and continue to choose their sins over God. One of the most controversial phrases that we'll see from our LDS perspective, because it really does undo the natural language of the Bible. And this has a lot of theological ramifications, but it centers around the idea of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Uh, because I have a philosophical mind, I tend to pay attention to this. I don't know how super valuable it is. We have looked at another lesson, I think in particular looking at the prosperity of Joseph and how the Lord did prosper Joseph. It leads to the question of like, in what ways is God involved in our lives? In what ways does he interact and impose his power and his spirit upon us? And I wanna leave that as an open-ended question because I don't wanna, like, come down with a bunch of force and authority on it. I have my perspectives where I do believe that the hand of God is truly involved in many, many ways in our lives, but God seems to have influence on the heart. And one of the things that you'll see here in these chapters is God influencing the hearts of Moses. He says that I will give you favor in the eyes of the Egyptians so that you can ask them, hey, can I borrow this gold? And then they will give it to him. Now, there's a lot of mystique around that, and I can't go into the great details on what that means. We have a similar example in the Book of Mormon where you have Nephi and Laman and Lemuel and Sam as they go back up to try and find wives that God says, I will give you favor. It's kind of the same exact language, just like favor among the Egyptians to get the gold, favor among the daughters of Ishmael to get the women. That's interesting. I can't tell you what that means, but it's something that I would invite you to ponder and think about, and how God is involved in your life and how maybe he does soften people's hearts. Maybe he does create a pathway. Maybe he does intervene in ways that are very difficult to perceive, but are also extremely impactful and real. So, and he hardened Pharaoh's heart that he hearkened not unto them as the Lord hath said. And the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened and he refuses to let the people go. So you'll see on the JST's version of this is that it changes, I believe, on every instance that instead of saying that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And I'm gonna try and bring a little bit of a mediated way to bring both of the original language of the Bible and that Joseph Smith translation together to some degree. Hopefully, it's not a wresting of the scriptures. Um, I I believe sometimes as long as at least I'm open about the theory and what I'm doing and not coming off hard, maybe I'll receive some grace along the side. But I think, from a phenomenological perspective, every human being I've ever met uses an expression similar to this: "You made me mad." All right. So think about what that means, right? An individual says something and you are accusing them that you have now done something that made me mad, that forced a reaction upon me. And this is from the phenomenological argument I'm making is that everybody has communicated it this way. And it almost feels like that because here I am along my path and then you do something and now I'm feeling all this anger. Now, there may be some behaviors that I also blame on you at the same time, but if we just zero in on the emotions, that's seems how the narrative goes. I'm happy, my emotions are stable. You start doing something, waving something in my face that bugs me, and then I feel a certain way. Cause the causation moves like this. And God, who knows us perfectly, certainly has the ability to do something with the absolute knowledge that it's going to produce this reaction. Now, we who respect agency, and in our church, we respect that agency in a very substantial way. I would say as much, if not more, than any other major religion on the planet. Obviously, we see that confront of God coming in and taking Pharaoh's agency and saying that he hardened his heart. A phenomenological way of like I said, bringing the two together would be that God did something knowing that Pharaoh's reaction to that would be that he hardened his heart. And God, because he knows with a perfect knowledge that if I do this thing, then Pharaoh will harden his heart, that it feels causative. It feels causative. Feels. Emphasis on feels, not is, because we still respect the agency. Even if God, with his foreknowledge, knows that we will react a certain way, it's still worth pointing out that we make the choice. This this could create a whole nuclear explosion, by the way, philosophically, because this actually takes you back all the way to the Garden of Eden and the whole mess of the snake and the serpent, because the idea is, okay, God has perfect knowledge, so what's going on here? Why is he allowing snakes? Well, he allows agency, but it's like if he didn't want this fall to happen, he could have prevented it. If he didn't want the suffering, if he didn't want the sin, if he didn't want the estrangement, if he didn't want all the death and consequences of the fall, he certainly could have prevented it. Now, it's easier to maybe reconcile from a neutral perspective. It's like, well, God, he does whatever he wants, he will do what he will do, and he just gave us agency and said, all right, bear the consequences. But we who believe in an ultimately loving God would say, to reconcile those two things, we have to say all that God does is motivated by love. So even the awkwardness and tension we experience in the Garden of Eden, which is a reflection of the the natural state that we run into with our own suffering, is why did God allow me to fall? Why did God allow me to have these terrible experiences, to be hurt in this way, to feel this way? What's it's as if God designed things and set up parameters to put me into this position where I want to harden my heart. I want to get angry. I want to beat somebody. I want to scream and shout or blaspheme. And you can go through the whole 10 commandments and just be like, there's a lot of pressure to do all of those. So why is the structure of existence set up the way that it is? And that's a good way of looking. I would say you can make a psychological, existential, or philosophical argument that that's a good way of reading the Genesis account. And as we look through this, obviously we have all of these different plagues that are put on Egypt. I have this super, super cool book here. It's called the Infographic Bible. It's probably like looks opposite if I'm showing this in my screen. So it's going to be like some ancient language, but it's really cool because it kind of breaks down the Bible in terms of images. And I really like the way that it portrays the different plagues. And this is commentary that you'll hear from others as well, but this has cool images. So shout out to whoever made this book, and you're welcome to look it up on Amazon yourself. But we have the connection with the different with each of these plagues that fall upon the Egyptians, and they represent a specific deity of the Egyptians. So the water turns to blood. There's Hapi. I'm probably going to mispronounce all of these. Happy or Happy, the Nile god. And so it's a way of God challenging each one of these primary gods and major gods in the Egyptian pantheon of the gods. So by God showing the dominance over the Nile by turning into blood, it's a way of showing that I am more powerful than your gods. We'll keep going through all of these. They're kind of fun to look at. Heket, the goddess of childbirth, depicted as a frog. And we have the plague of the frogs. We have the plague of the gnats. There's Geb, god of the earth and vegetation, father of snakes. There's Khepri, the god of creation and sun, associated with scarab beetle, which can be associated with the swarm of flies. There's Hathor, mother and sky god, depicted as I can't see what this says. I believe it says cow, and that's where we have the deadly livestock. So we have a scarab beetle, we have a cow, we have snakes, we have frogs. You can see how all these things are starting to, they all represent something that Moses is challenging. We have Isis, who's the goddess of life and associated with healing, and we have the plague of boils. We have thunder and hail, which looks at Seth, who's depicted in wind and storms. Min, the goddess of fertility and vegetation, to which we have locusts coming in and getting the vegetation. There's Horus, who's associated with the sun god and the darkness that is put over the land. And last, the final god, the personal god of Pharaoh and judge of the dead, is Osiris and the killing of the firstborn. So if you're looking at why each of these plagues is there, it's that I find that to be a really interesting, and that's the answer that has suited me the most. Uh, rather than harp on Pharaoh, I mean, I've met with many people in a clinical perspective, and it's a lot easier being on the outside to see things, but sometimes it's like, why is it? This might be an introspective question, but why is it that we cannot see the plagues sometimes in our lives? The plagues, these things these miraculous things happening that are trying to witness to you to turn course. Maybe introspectively, that's the thing. Like, what am I missing right now that I should be paying attention to? That I'm not, which goes back to that first part on the burning bush. Moses noticed something and turned aside. Each one of these things is a wonder. It's a miracle. It was intended to be a sign. And the question is are you attentive enough to turn to that and try to figure out what's happening? And then as you do that, what is your relationship and how do you approach that which is sacred, holy, and divine? Are you willing to approach it with meekness and humility? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And we see a contrast to that with hardened. Now, we do have in Exodus 8, I was going to mention this, that in one of the verses, glad that I just happened upon it. Perhaps that's the miracle of the day. But Exodus 8:15, it says, "But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart and hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said." I was going to say there is an example. Maybe there's one or two examples where it specifically says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart in the text. So, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he hearkened not unto them. So that would be an example of it kind of being a little bit more broad, who's involved in that. So what are we supposed to gather from these stories? What's the principal message? We looked at Pharaoh, we looked at Moses, and if you're looking through these chapters, it's just going through the different plagues. Pharaoh saying he's going to let them go, and then he reneges on that and then doesn't, and then it gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And you see this idea of the doubling down. It's like at some point Pharaoh's got to truly know that this is going on. And it's interesting because if you read Pharaoh's language, he's like, okay, I now know that Yahweh is God. Like, I'm going to respect this. But then he just reneges on it immediately the next day. And you could think that is that all just for the personal gain? Is it the pride that he has? We don't know what the full depth of it is, but it is something that I believe if we're trying to liken the scriptures unto ourselves, these are interesting questions for us, as pride may be the most cardinal sin to begin with, right? The serpent who was cunning beguiled Eve. There's this idea of something in the cunningness of the serpent, which in the Hebrew, it's something I'm not, I don't speak Hebrew, but it's like arum is the word for cunning. And then later when we see a word for nakedness, it's like harum. And those two words are associated to show that the cunning that we have, that even our intelligence, our plans, our nakedness, they're nothing. The serpent becomes dust, the cunning becomes nakedness. And the emphasis on humility, pride being the cardinal sin, the solution is humility. And so when we read a story like we do in Exodus, it should really give us a moment to ponder, like, check your pride levels. Uh, Not easy to tell that to another person because they're just going to hit you with the Matthew 7 judge not that you be not judged right back at you, but it's relevant from an introspective question. I believe if you wanted to do a cross reference, we could probably find that in Alma chapter 5. Have ye stripped yourself of pride? If we want to wax scriptural and give some props to the prophet Alma. So here we'll find the verse here in real time. Behold, are ye stripped of pride? I say unto you, if ye are not prepared to meet God. Behold, ye must prepare quickly, for the kingdom of heaven is soon at hand, and such as one hath not eternal life. I'm going to take quickly and use that as a semantical uh, association to the one of the emphases of the whole redemption story, because broadly speaking, the story and narrative Exodus is a messianic story. Just like Joseph brought a messianic redemption to the Egyptians from from the extraordinary famine that would have consumed them all. Here we have God doing this extraordinary miracle. And the title of this is to remember this day in which he came out of Egypt. The whole Sabbath day, when we would look through some of these verses, becomes deeply associated, not just with the rest of the Lord, but with Moses. So here we are using some ChatGPT here, but is the Sabbath day connected to Moses and their redemption? And it will pull out the verse and reference for me and specifically say, like, one of the main things that you're supposed to remember on the Sabbath is this redemption. And remember that it was a servant in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God brought thee out. Therefore, the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. So we, as Christians, we move even further from this because we have the idea of Sabbath. So in the book of Exodus, Sabbath is creation. Book of Deuteronomy, Sabbath is redemption. We see I'm not saying that we're supposed to ignore the creation component. It's just adding meaning to it. And we also see that in the transition from the Jewish Sabbath to what we practice in Christianity is that it becomes the Lord's Day, which is the day of the redemption of God, the day that God, Christ, redeemed us from death. And that's supposed to be looked at as a deep parallel with Moses as they're crossing through the Red Sea. The crossing of the Red Sea it's a baptism. It's facing and passing through death, and the idea of the ultimate redemption that comes through God. What are we supposed to do on the Sabbath? Contemplate and remember. Contemplate and remember the redemption that came. Consider Moses. Maybe exercise a little gratitude for that. Primarily, remember Christ and the redemption that he offers through the resurrection, but also through the atoning sacrifice that redeems us from spiritual death. That should be the meditation every single Sabbath day. And you think about it, Moses is over 1,000 years before Christ comes. They have 1,000 year time to remember. And then post Christ, we have, after his death, this remembering these grand miracles. Those are the miracle of creation, the miracle of Moses's redemption, and the miracle of Christ's redemption are the primary, the primary things associated with our Sabbath. And that would be something worth investigating in your own Sabbath. So again, if you're teaching this, it might feel like a curveball, but it's, what do you do on your Sabbath? What do you do to worship God on the Sabbath day? What do you do to remember the Lord the Sabbath day? What do you do to make Sabbath days holy? And they'd be like, what are you talking about? We're supposed to be talking about Moses, but it's like, we are, because this redemption story is specifically mentioned to be a focus of that. And yes, we can look at these specific stories. We can spend time reflecting perhaps on the redemption of Israel from Egypt. We can look at the Christ, but I would say also to make it very specific to your life. How is Christ redeeming me? Where am I seeing miracles? Where am I seeing freedom? If you live in the United States, you're not a slave. And that's because people have made tremendous sacrifices to God, following the principles and virtues, the spirit of liberation that's associated with the Spirit of God. And were it not for those contributions and sacrifices, we might be slaves. And so we can see the work of God through the lives of the people, moving them in the past to bring us to where we're at. So there's a lot of power in that. I have up here on Exodus 11, again, that happenstance. If you wanted the evidence of it, the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, which people said that this is like reparations. They often describe the delivering, that this is God is fighting the war for them. And it was common the days that in war you got the spoils of your war. And so they're not necessarily fighting against the Egyptians because the Lord is fighting for them. Um, it's hard to know as well. I mean, I don't know how many of the Egyptians were getting cursed and suffering from the plagues. I start to wonder as well, like we do have the posts on the doors, something that the Egyptians could have made that sacrifice and sign. Pharaoh was unwilling to, but it makes you wonder from the Gentile perspective of how many of the Egyptians saw the signs and repented. We know Pharaoh's story, but it's an interesting way of looking at that, because uh, sometimes we read this from the perspective of the most good and the most bad, but almost from the Egyptian perspective, as we exist here in the United States, the great Egypt of our times, the Babylon prophesied of, right? As the world gets more and more wicked, and we don't have to single out America. There's plenty of other wicked nations that you could cluster in with it. But I think that there's some uniqueness to what's mentioned, especially if you get to um, the emphasis on the merchants and how the merchants are interacting with all the other world, and some of the specific verses in the Book of Mormon that seem to highlight this land specifically, noting that this land will be the most prideful of all other nations. Like, this is the Egypt of our times. What a blessing it is to know that God shielded the children of Israel from the majority of the plagues. There was a few that hit them initially, which is fascinating as well. I don't think the children of Israel were completely uh, prepared for this, and they seem to give Moses a little bit of grief at the beginning, And certainly, the first thing that happens is there's a plague, and then Pharaoh's like, all right, you guys can't make your bricks with straw anymore. You're gonna have to collect your own straw. And they're like, wow. They start to curse God and they get mad really quick. And they're like, who is Moses? So there is even this interesting test that happens among the Israelites. And eventually they soften towards Moses and start to follow. And as they do that, there's also grace given towards them. But as they do that, the Israelites begin to be shielded from the consequences of that. Something that, as we contemplate the second coming and the judgments that are to come, we can hold tight um, to this type and shadow, perhaps, of the story of Moses, and have faith that God will be with us and protect us as He executes His great and final judgment prior to the great coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So, the final thing that I wanted to point out is the redemption comes through Christ. I don't want to open up at the very last second the whole drama of faith versus works, but you can see a little micro drama of the faith versus works. Now, the redemption comes through God. There's no disputation. Obviously, the whole story is these profound miracles that the people cannot do this on their own. However, God does expect things of the people. He says, you guys need to take the blood of the lambs and put it on the posts of your door. Also, there's this dietary thing. We have a lot of the emphases on the blood because of the obvious symbolism of the blood of Christ, which allows, when we have access and utilize the blood of Christ, it puts away the angel of death from up on us. And that symbolism is so powerful and dramatic and accurate that deserves to. The thing that in this reading, I came to appreciate the idea of the unleavened bread a little bit. And the emphasis on the unleavened bread was that we don't have time to allow for our bread to rise. We need to move quickly. And the reason this maybe struck me more so is because it does bring a lot more, again, faith versus works. Here I am beating the horse of works a little bit stronger, but the idea is, what's our role and responsibilities in redemption? And one of the key things that's in this narrative that's emphasized is go quickly. This is your moment of redemption. Don't delay. Don't wait. Take advantage of the opportunity. Redemption is here. Take it. You don't have time for your bread to rise. Just go now. God is here. God is in this moment. And that would be a way of looking at that. And this goes all the way back into the contrast of Pharaoh hardening his heart, Moses being attentive to see the burning bush. God is with us today. We'll eventually run into that verse in Deuteronomy, but it's this idea of today. God's Spirit is here today. The burning bush, the mountain, the symbols of God, it's there. It's always there. Are we attentive? Are we looking? Are we humble? Are we ready? Are you waiting for your bread to rise? Are you going to get there and take advantage of the redemption that is here now, today? Deuteronomy 29:12, that thou shouldst enter into covenant with the Lord thy God and into his oath, which the Lord thy God maketh with thee this day, that he may establish thee today for a people for himself, and that he may be unto thee a God, as he hath said unto thee, and as he hath sworn unto our fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Neither with you only do I make this covenant and with this oath, but with him that standeth here with us this day before our Lord. That was the feeling and the idea that was emerging from the idea of the unleavened bread today. And what is God trying to accomplish here? What's the whole purpose of this redemption? And the core of this is that and we read this in the book of Exodus, is that God is redeeming us so that he can make us a people. And we get this very, very early in Exodus. And this is to me, this is like the primary narrative theme that we need to read and understand the scriptures through, is that God is trying to make himself a people. And the idea is that he will be our God. I'm going to redeem you so that you guys can be my people and I will be your God. And so this is really cool because this gets established really, really early here. We can see that in the narrative, and I want to point that out because it being one of the most primary themes and relevant to us because we'd say, well, what is God trying to do? If we encountered the divine on the mountain and in the burning bush, what's the ultimate purpose of this? He's going to liberate us if we'll have him. It's going to take 40 years in a wilderness wandering to get that full liberation. But the ultimate goal is it's the end goal of this is for us to be the people of God and for him to be our God, which is that is the covenant made to Enoch and Noah, the rainbow, that we will be the people of God and look upward and keep the covenant so that we can obtain the full blessings of God. So you can see this. I have it pulled up now. This is Exodus chapter 6. We'll look at verses 6 and 7. It mentioned that I have remembered my covenant, Abrahamic, but also with Enoch, the Noah Enoch covenant. This is the covenant that goes all the way and is tied to the city of Enoch. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians and will rid you out of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched arm and with great judgments. Are you paying attention? Are you prepared? Are you ready? Are you waiting for the bread to rise? Think about that. And I will take take you to me for a people who are the people of God Zion, and I will be to you a God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, which bringeth you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. So contemplate that in terms of our own redemption. God is trying to redeem us to make us a people. Are we paying attention? Are we ready? Are you going to take advantage of the redemption that's available? See the miracles that are before you, or are we going to harden our hearts? And this is all happening today. So don't wait and don't delay. So God bless you all. Until next time, and we'll see you then.